of God, a God of justice and kindness and humility. Amen. Please be seated. What does the Lord require of you? Micah's question is disarmingly simple. It is not asked in a moment of calm religious reflection, but in the midst of moral collapse. The prophet addresses a people who are deeply religious, meticulous in their worship, and generous, and yet something essential is missing. They wish to know how to satisfy God, and Micah answers by stripping everything back. This is what the Lord requires: to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. This is not abstract faith. It's not an inward piety sealed off from the world. It is a life shaped visibly and publicly by justice. And when we turn to the gospel reading today and see Jesus seated on the hillside, surrounded by the poor and the overlooked, we hear the same truth given flesh. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. This is not a list of private virtues. It is a description of a reordered world. And for this reason, justice stands at the centre of the Christian faith. It is not an optional extra or a special interest for those radical lefts like your priest, but as a way of naming what God's reign actually looks like when it enters human life. Walter Brueggemann is arguably the greatest Old Testament scholar of recent decades, and I had the great fortune of meeting him quite a few times. He even commented on a couple of papers I wrote. He insisted always that biblical faith is never neutral. He writes that justice in the biblical tradition is, quote, the concrete shape of God's fidelity to the vulnerable. Justice is what God's faithfulness looks like on the ground in economic arrangements, political decisions, in decisions about whose lives are protected and whose are expendable by the state. And this insight matters because justice is so often misunderstood or framed entirely in the public's imagination as retribution, punishment. Someone's done something wrong, therefore the correct response and the only response is to punish them. Balance is restored, we believe, in this system through payback and retribution. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But this is not the sort of justice that Micah envisions, and it is not the sort of justice that Jesus comes to proclaim. The justice of the Christian faith is restorative. It is concerned about repairing broken relationships, returning those diminished to a place of dignity and participation, giving voice to the stories of survivors and victims, restoring right relationship between God, neighbour and land. It is no coincidence that around the world truth and reconciliation commissions, which have taken place in South Africa, Rwanda, East Timor and many other places, have been undergirded by deeply Christian ideas about restorative justice. James Allison, another theologian whom I've had the pleasure to meet several times, and has actually used some of my writings in his lectures on Genesis and other topics. He helps us see how radical restorative justice is. He observes that human societies are almost always instinctively arranged around blame, trying to find out who can we blame, identifying threats, isolating them, punishing them, expelling them. Justice, in this distorted sense, Allison argues, becomes the management of violence through respectable forms of punishment. Allison insists, as does Brueggemann, as do many other writers, that the gospel exposes this as a false logic. Allison writes, quote, the innocence of the victim and the mendacity of the system that needs victims is exposed by the cross. Jesus is not killed because God requires vengeance, because God gives retribution against the Son in the place of us, but because to expose that our system of retributive violence doesn't work. God's response is not retaliation, but restoration and resurrection. And this impacts how we hear the Beatitudes, because when Jesus blesses the poor and the mourning and the persecuted, He's not romanticising suffering. He is naming where God stands. He's announcing that those pushed to the margins of the world system remain firmly within God's sight and care, and that God stands unequivocally with them. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. This hunger is not a hunger for moral purity, but it's hunger for a world no longer organised around fear, domination and exclusion. Brueggemann says this hunger for righteousness is a willingness and a hunger for us to participate in God's new ordering of social reality, of us refusing to accept settled arrangements which say inequality is inevitable, which say despair is just disguised as realism, and that we should refuse that. Well, you may say that's all well and good. What does that actually look like on the ground? What if we took an example of massive injustice and thought about restorative justice in that context? And of course, the Trump administration provides an endless, almost daily update of examples of injustice and the dire consequences. But one of the unexpected or unintended consequences, or some people say intended consequences, is the removal of a focus on other big injustices. And I'm not talking about the Epstein files. I'm talking about things like the war in Ukraine. So I thought, I saw something on Facebook saying everybody's forgetting about Ukraine because of such a focus on America. So I thought, there's an element of truth to that. I'm going to preach on restorative justice and think about in the situation of Ukraine. So let me bring you back up to speed, because details about Ukraine have moved from the front page to just the occasional short update. In February 2022, Russian forces illegally invaded Ukraine, exposing the imperial ambition and brutal calculus of power that Putin wishes to wield. The Russian war apparatus has repeatedly targeted civilian infrastructure, power stations, water systems, hospitals, apartment buildings. Mariupol was reduced to ruins through months of siege warfare that killed tens of thousands of civilians, many buried, we now know, in mass graves. In Bucha, evidence has emerged of executions, torture and bodily violence against civilians. These are not isolated atrocities, but patterns repeated in Kherson, Izium and dozens of other communities. The human cost is staggering. The United Nations Refugee Agency has recorded 12.7 million people, roughly, who are in need of humanitarian assistance inside Ukraine. 12.7 million. 10 million Ukrainians are living as refugees in other countries or are internally displaced. The United Nations says, quote, "The energy crisis, which has been a particular target of the Russian military, the energy system that has resulted in an energy crisis, is disrupting public access to water, electricity, heating, healthcare, education and social protection. More than 2.5 million homes in the country of Ukraine, 13% of the entire housing stock, have been damaged or destroyed." It's hard to imagine the impact this is having on children growing up in this environment. They've had their education largely removed, their sense of safety shattered, living with trauma, separated from families often, and the psychological wounds will endure well after the fighting ends. This aggression and this war must be named truthfully, and doing justice always involves truth-telling. That's why those commissions are called Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. The Beatitudes and restorative justice are never sentimental. Blessed are the peacemakers does not mean ignoring violence. Peacemaking begins, in fact, with reality, with refusing to sanitize what has been done to real bodies, minds, souls and communities. But this is where restorative justice comes in, because retributive justice tempts us to frame the war and all such catastrophes entirely in terms of enemies and punishment of enemies, to speak in terms of victory as a crushing defeat of those enemies. If justice is framed only as retribution, it falls short of this Christian vision. This never means denying accountability, War crimes must be documented, investigated and prosecuted. Survivors must be heard. Reparations must be paid. This is not optional, it is foundational to restorative justice. But restorative justice always asks harder questions that tend to be avoided. How can we rebuild shattered cities without recreating the conditions that fostered war? How can communities process occupation and trauma without allowing grief to harden into permanent hatred? How does a society remember truthfully without becoming captive to revenge? And perhaps most challengingly, what might it mean to imagine ordinary Russians, many themselves subject to authoritarian violence, being received back into the human community? These are not questions that could be answered today or tomorrow because the wounds are too fresh and the violence is ongoing. But they are questions that restorative justice refuses to abandon. James Allison writes with great insight that forgiveness in the gospel is the, quote, the discovery that we do not need enemies in order to be ourselves. Let me say that again. Quote, forgiveness is, quote, the discovery that we do not need enemies in order to be ourselves. It insists that the goal of justice cannot be the eternal perpetuation of enmity. We glimpse efforts of restorative justice already at work in the Ukraine war, in the careful documentation of war crimes and atrocities, in the aid that communities are giving one another, often when they are displaced, and in the efforts by journalists, academics, and others to distinguish between the Russian state and the Russian people, even when that distinction feels unbearably costly. We are seeing similar efforts made in the distinction between, for instance, anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. We are similarly making distinctions between MAGA Christianity, quote unquote, I use the word Christianity there with caution, and what I would say is historic Christianity. We're distinguishing between ordinary Americans such as those in Minnesota who are opposing Trump administration from the Trump administration itself. Always these distinctions are important, but they can be unbearably costly. They are fragile acts of resistance and hope, resisting the claim that retribution will define the future. Christian justice dares us to imagine a world beyond permanent enmity, not because suffering is trivial, but because God refuses to allow violence to have the final word. This is not simply a problem for those in Russia or America or Gaza, because these things can feel far away, but the same logic of retributive justice is everywhere, and we need to fight it wherever it appears. When all the effort simply goes into assigning blame, working out who to believe or dismiss, and how to mete out punishment, so often those who are in pain are ignored and restoration is overlooked. To do restorative justice is to resist that retributive logic wherever it appears, in our churches, in our communities, even in our own hearts. It looks like listening to marginalised voices, to having patience with complexity, to refuse the making of scapegoats. It means confronting our own tendencies towards violence. And it is having a stubborn hope, a hope that God's future is not secured by violence and retribution, but gifted to us through forgiveness, reconciliation, and restoration. Allison reminds us that the risen Christ returns not with vengeance but with peace, and critically, as I've mentioned in other sermons in recent months, Christ's resurrected body bears the wounds of his life, the holes in the hands and the wound in his side. He takes this as a metaphor or as a symbol of the fact that restorative justice always acknowledges harm. History is never erased, and yet a new possibility opens up before us. So as I said before, justice for all of these reasons is not an accessory to the gospel, it is the heart of life under God's good reign. Micah names it, Jesus embodies it, the Spirit draws us into it patiently and so often imperfectly. Do we accord again this day to be those who walk humbly, to be those who are lovers of kindness and doers of justice, not because we're confident of our own goodness, but because we trust the one who blesses the poor, raises the crucified, and refuses to give up on what David Bentley Hart says is a world grown weary with the burden of itself. Amen.